welcome back. Hopefully, you had a good discussion with your small groups about revising and editing your manuscripts. Now, let's talk about general mechanics, something that I love. As a former English grammar teacher, I think general mechanics is an exciting topic. And unfortunately, I'm usually alone in that arena. No one else is excited about it as I am. Most people see it as drudgery, as copious rule following, things that don't always make sense, which is all true. But I kind of like figuring things out and tinkering with things and understanding how and why they are the way they are. So, in this section on general mechanics, we'll talk about some of the rules of the road, and I'll give you some tips on some things that you can look for as you're reviewing for general mechanical issues. And then we'll talk about a few of the more common issues that you'll see in general mechanics, or even the ones that you might make. So let's start off with a question. What issues do you have in general mechanics? What are some common mistakes that you might make when you're doing your manuscript writing and development? So jot down one thing that is a problem for you in mechanics. And it could be a problem that you just make unconsciously every time you write. You don't know why. So write something down, and we'll be back in just a second. What'd you write down? I'm curious. I need to know. One of my issues is spelling. I routinely spell the same words incorrectly over and over and over again. And I don't know why. I mean, I know how to spell the word. It's a very common word in many instances, but I'll just misspell it. It may be a typing thing, or I'm hurrying, or something is going on, but I will consistently misspell the same words over and over again. Some folks have trouble with homonyms and homophones, things that sound alike or are spelled alike but are pronounced differently, making sure they're choosing the right word. So different folks have different issues in mechanics, and we're going to try to go through a lot of these and kind of unpack them a bit. We're going to learn to cut and paste kids. We're going to learn to cut and paste kids. There's a problem with this sentence. Are we going to cut and paste children? That does not seem good, right? No, we need a comma here. We want to tell the children that we're going to cut and paste. We would assume other things other than the children, right? So mechanics matter. We want people to understand what we're writing about. We don't want them to think we're going to cut and paste our children. That seems a little violent. So we want to be specific in our language. Mechanics, like this comma, matter. So some general mechanical issues that you'll want to be aware of. Spelling is essential and important. So go back through your spelling, make sure that you're spelling words correctly. I talked a minute about words that sound the same but are actually spelled differently and have different meanings. A good example is there, and there in the English language. They all sound exactly the same. They have different meanings. There is a possessive pronoun. It's their ball, right? There. There is another form of pronoun. It means I'm going over there, that place, over there, right? And then it's a contraction as well. They are going to the store. They're going to the store. They're all sound the same, but they have different meanings and different spellings. So you want to make sure that you're following general mechanics in spelling. Also in capitalization, make sure that the things that you've capitalized are appropriate to be capitalized. Enough said, right? Abbreviations, same thing. When you introduce something that needs to be abbreviated or that you're going to abbreviate, you want to be sure that you're setting that off in parentheses. If it is an acronym or something like that, be sure you're spelling it out initially, and then you can set it off. And then if you go back and make changes, you want to make sure that you're making sure that you've got that spelling out version of the acronym or the abbreviation is listed the first time. Numbers. What's the cutoff point between writing out a number, O-N-E for 1, and putting the number 1? Is there a cutoff point? This may be journal specific or discipline specific, so you want to look that up and be sure that, if you're putting the number 1, that it should instead be the word 1. Italics and underlining. Underlining is a little bit less common in manuscripts these days, but you do see a good deal of italics. When is it appropriate? When is it not appropriate? You want to go back and, again, look at the style for that journal and that discipline and make sure that you're following the rules of the road. Next, we've got phrasal verbs. So two verbs that are side by side, they mean one thing. When you split them up with a word in between, they mean something completely different, okay? So be sure that you're using the right phrasal verb. Next, we've got idioms, highly tied to phrasal verbs, because a lot of these phrasal verb combos, especially when the two verbs are together, become an idiom. So you want to make sure that you're reducing or minimizing your use of idioms. Not everyone is going to get them in an international journal. And they can have very specific meaning, and unfortunately, the common use of idioms changes over time, and it can change rapidly, so that an idiomatic phrase that makes complete sense to you and may be common in an American audience isn't as common anywhere else in the world. And over time, it could fall out of favor and not be used as often. So going back with your regular words, not as exciting, but it's definitely going to be a little bit more helpful for you. And then lastly, compound words. What are compound words? Well, anything can be a compound word. It's two words put together, right? So you want to be sure that you're using them correctly. Can you just put them together with no space between them? Do you need a hyphen between them, or do you need a space between them? So you want to make sure that you're using compound words appropriately. Some other elements that you might want to consider is grammar, punctuation, style, and structure of your writing. So let's dig in on these. So grammar is just your regular parts of speech in English. We've got your verbs, and you want to make sure you're using the consistent and correct tense. You've got prepositions. You want to make sure of the proper placement of your prepositions in your sentences. Adjectives and adverbs, you want to reduce your use of both of these. Minimize the use of adverbs and adjectives. Pronouns, you want to make sure that you're consistent, that you always have a referent for your pronoun. Conjunctions, that you're using them correctly and consistently. Nouns and interjections are less of an issue, especially interjections. You'll probably hardly ever use them in your scholarly writing. I don't know. I can't think of a time when I've needed to use an interjection. But you want to make sure you've got the right punctuation with your interjections. And with nouns pointing to pronouns, you want to make sure that they're consistent and used correctly. So those are some issues with grammar. Punctuation is a very big deal because punctuation rules in English don't make sense. We know this. And some of the rules are very flexible. Sometimes it matters, sometimes it doesn't matter. Sometimes it matters only if you're inconsistent. But if you consistently do something every time, it doesn't matter as much. So you want to be sure you're thinking about the rules of the road in terms of punctuation. I've brought 3 common problems for you, and they all have to deal with the use of commas. So you want to be sure that after an introductory phrase, you're using a comma. Here's an example. After the first experiment failed, comma, we adjusted the amount of reagent. So after the first experiment failed is your introductory phrase. So at that point, you want to be sure that you're inserting a comma. You may not actually pause when you say it, but you need to include that because that phrase needs a comma after it. The second common error that you're going to find is using a comma in a compound sentence. You want to consistently do this. Here's an example. The literature portrays the harmful and negative effects of stress on the body, comma, but our research found that, and so on and so forth, right? So it's a compound sentence because it really is 2 sentences put together, but they're put together using that comma and the conjunction but. So you want to make sure that you've got the comma and the but there together, joining those compound sentences. And you obviously don't want to have your whole manuscript to be one compound sentence after the other. You want to break it up. Use simple sentences and compound sentences, and you certainly don't want them all to be run-on sentences. But in this instance, we've got the conjunction and the comma here that helps our compound sentence work. And then lastly, another common one is when you have a comma splice. You actually have 2 compound sentences kind of stuck together with nothing between them. And they really don't work well at all. So if you're in doubt, you want to add the comma and the conjunction or make them into 2 sentences. It's what they are already. It just means you're going to have two simple sentences perhaps back to back, and you want to reduce that as much as possible. So here's an example. The star-nosed mole is noted for its style of communication. The male uses the 22 pink fleshy appendages as a touch organ. You can see I've broken this into two sentences. And originally it was one sentence. You certainly could put a colon there after the word communication and a conjunction there to kind of help bridge that. But in this instance, it makes sense to go into two sentences. So use your best judgment. If you're struggling with it, there are some websites that are great where you can put your sentences in and it will kind of give you a punctuation critique and help you figure out the right punctuation. Some other punctuation issues that you'll see, the proper use of quotation marks, especially single and double quotation marks. It can get really confusing when you have a quote within a quote. So be careful and look those instances up. Also, where do your other punctuation marks go inside your quotation marks or outside your quotation marks? This is going to vary by discipline and by the style of the journal. Commas, we kind of already talked about that there are lots of issues with commas. You've also got colons. Some people don't want to use colons ever because they're kind of confused about when to use them. Use them in joining two compound sentences together. And that's the primary time that you're going to use them. There are some other instances, though, so you might want to look those up to see if you need a colon. Apostrophes. A big one about apostrophes is apostrophes are not used with plural words, generally speaking. You don't use an apostrophe to make a plural word, I should say. You can certainly use apostrophes with plural words. They're primarily used for contractions and to show possession, so you want to be sure you're using those correctly. Colons, you want to make sure you have the right spacing around the colon, and then if it's an items in a series after the colon, that you're consistent about your use of commas in your items in a series, especially before the conjunction that goes at the end of that item list. Exclamation points, you're probably going to reduce those just like interjections in your scholarly writing, but you want to be mindful of those and how often you're using them and how close they are together. And then question marks, again, probably not going to be using those as often, but just be mindful about how often they're appearing and how close together. Some style issues that are important for you to think about is your point of view. Do you have a point of view in your writing? We certainly think about point of view when we think about literature. Not necessarily about scholarly writing, but we definitely have a point of view. There's definitely a slant. There's definitely an approach that we're coming from that we want to be clear and consistent about because it can create a bias in our writing, and we want to be good and eliminate as many biases as we can. So we need to acknowledge that we're going to have a point of view, but that we want to minimize it, and we certainly want to be consistent and clear about it. The verb tense. Oh, you definitely don't want to change your verb tense throughout your paper. You want to be consistent with using the present tense or the past tense. And if you do need to switch tenses, to be very clear, to have a good transition between those switches so that the reader's not caught off guard. Because a lot of times we settle in and we start reading something and we're kind of into it, and then something throws us out of that sync or out of that groove that we're in. So you want to be consistent with your verb tenses, or at least introduce, using good transitions, the change in tense. The mood that you're setting. Sometimes we have negative research findings. Sometimes we have a negative book review. We want to be thoughtful about the mood that we're setting and the tone that we're setting. We also want to be sure about our voice. We're using active voice or passive voice. We're using a mix of those. Do we have too much active voice, too much passive voice? So think that through as you're looking at your verb choice to make sure that your voice is clear and forceful. Variety, that you have a variety of sentences. I mentioned earlier that you don't want to have all simple sentences. You don't want to have all compound or complex sentences, that you want to kind of mix that up a little bit. So be sure you've got a good variety of sentences. If you have emphasis issues, if you really want to point something out, try mixing the word order in the sentence. Try putting your most important word first, setting it off by a comma to see if that will help with emphasis. Because you don't want folks to miss the point, nor do you want to have to, put it in bold and underline and italics just so that they see the point. And then lastly, word choice. Be very careful and conservative about your word choice. I would say look at each word and make it stand on its own. Make it justify its reason for being there. And if you can go to a higher, more powerful, better word, do it. But you obviously don't want to overdo these high powered words either. So be thoughtful and careful about your word choice. When we talk about structure, what we really are looking at is how we're connecting our sentences together, the transitions between the sentences. Where does one sentence stop and another one start? Again, it's that how many simple sentences do we have in a row? How many compound or complex sentences do we have in a row? And how do we connect paragraphs? Where does the one thought end and a new thought begin? How do we bridge that? And again, we don't want a whole page that's all one paragraph, and we don't want a page that's like 20 paragraphs because they're all like 2 sentences long. How do we connect them? How do we bridge those paragraphs together? And then the last thing is, how do we connect our sections? We don't want to get to the end of the introduction and just kind of chop it off and start a whole new thought. We want there to be some progression between our different sections of our manuscript. So hopefully looking at general mechanics has been helpful. It's definitely one of my favorite things to talk about. If you have questions or comments or concerns, please reach out to me. Here's my email address. And until then, good luck with your publication.